Hello, my name is Andre Phillips, and I'm going to be talking to you today about one of the papers that I published a few years ago. This paper looks at some of the cues used by bitterling fish to lay their eggs in freshwater mussels. And yes, you heard that right. These fish lay their eggs in freshwater mussels. So we kind of need to have an understanding of how the females are using the cues that are coming from this mussel to decide whether they want to lay eggs in it or not. Similarly, the males need to decide if they're going to invest their sperm into this mussel or not. And this is very important to understand for various reasons, but these fish, the European bitterling, are widespread in Europe, though many species in East Asia are critically endangered, and they need as much information about how they spawn, how they oviposit, to better understand the conservation efforts involved there. Similarly, the freshwater mussels are also critically endangered that many of these fish use and parasitize, and having an in-depth understanding of how these two interact will also be beneficial for their conservation. And this is the artificial freshwater mussel. Many studies before have looked at what cues the fish use to detect and decide a good mussel for their eggs or their sperm. But this artificial mussel will allow us to change those cues and look more precisely at what are the most important or least important parts of a mussel. The fish identify these by inspection behaviour at the front of the mussel, where they smell the outflow of the mussel and detect a variety of cues. The water for this artificial mussel comes in through a gravity-fed tank to here, and then goes through a venturi system, a small aperture tube aiming through a large aperture tube, working like a fuel injector in your car. This allows the water to be sucked back through this siphon and out this siphon, producing a cyclical flow very similar to what is seen in a live mussel, however, with us being able to control all the inputs. This has worked very effectively, the fish fully respond to it, and even goes so far as have left fertilized eggs within it. Next, I will show you the experimental design that this mussel was used in. So in this experiment, we used a holding tank to hold the water that was then going to go through the artificial mussel. This contained all the different treatments. We had various different holding tanks for different treatments. It contained either mussels or no mussels, and this was by having 80 mussels producing a lot of odors, and this would be fed through the pipe to the artificial mussel. And we also controlled flow. This was controlled through the pipe, just in squeezing the pipe or not. And finally, we controlled oxygen. This was controlled using oxygen bubbled through the water or nitrogen bubbled through the water to produce two very different treatments. This water was then gravity fed to the experimental tank, where we had our artificial mussel, where we had one female and two males. This allowed us to see fully natural behaviour in a semi-natural environment and allowed us to look at how they would respond to these three cues in combination. We looked at the male's response in terms of sperm release, and we looked at the female's response in terms of skimming. Not quite egg release, but it's on the way to being egg release as part of the series of behaviours that lead to successful oviposition. There was not enough egg releases to be used in analysis for this project. So the analysis for this experiment was actually very challenging. We had half of the treatments which did not contain any mussel smell, and this meant that the fish did not perform many behaviours towards the artificial mussel. To deal with this zero-inflated data, we used zero-altered or hurdle models. They first look at the occurrence of a behaviour, for instance for males sperm release and for females skimming. This looked then at subsequently the levels, the frequency of that behaviour and what affected that in terms of the cues that we had added to the mussel. This showed some really interesting results with, in both cases, the males and the females demonstrating importance of the mussel smell. But in males specifically, the flow was vitally important for their increase in behaviour of sperm release, something we'd not expected. For the females, they focus mainly on oxygen levels, oxygen difference between the ambient and also absolute oxygen coming from the mussel. In both male and female, the size of the male was an important factor in how much behaviour was shown. So we now have, thanks to these results, a better understanding of the cues that the fish are using to decide whether to invest their resources or not into a mussel. Males, fascinatingly, are using a flow cue. This is something we didn't really understand before, but we now have an idea of what this could mean. Bitterling use a very interesting system of topping up the mussels, where the territorial male will constantly release a low level of sperm within the mussel. This is to ensure that when the female lays an egg, there is his sperm in that mussel ready to fertilize it. This is part of the sperm competition network that exists in this system. A male that releases more sperm may be needing to release more sperm as the mussel is removing his previous sperm at a higher flow rate. The females are using the cue of oxygen, something that we already understood, but is very important to have empirically proven. This is important for various reasons, as fish eggs are very oxygen hungry, and bitterling eggs are larger than an average fish of that size, due to the fact that they have to fit within the lamellae of the freshwater mussel. This is fascinating because we now have two systems where there's a male and a female, but they have got conflicting ideas of what the best mussel for their resources are. This allows us to look a little bit further at the conflict this produces in this species. There's also an interesting role of comparative oxygen in the females, where they are able to measure not only the absolute oxygen that's coming from the mussel, but also that compared to the ambient area. This is important as bitterling can survive in very low oxygen environments, yet still need to find valid places to keep their eggs. There's also a role of male size. This is important as a territorial male who is larger will be able to better defend the mussel physically, but if can't defend it physically, will release more sperm. This leads us to much more fascinating topics of the sperm competition that exists within this fish. Thank you so much for listening to my talk, and I really look forward to hearing your questions.